Wait for it. Wait for it. Come on. Oh, there we go. We're live. StreamYard's had a little bit of a hiccup for a second. I thought they might hate us, Doc. All right. So, hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans. It could. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans. It's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just three nerdy veterans geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. The podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, we're going to introduce the topic first. So today, as you can see by the title, it's another fireside chat. We didn't want to bore you or stagnate with just author interviews, so we try to mix it up a little bit. And so if you're also reading the title, because, you know, we like readers here, you'll notice the title was Werewolves, Vampires, and Fairies. Oh, my. So that's what we're here to talk about. I blame Doc. Everything here is Doc's fault. Does that work for you, Doc?
No. This is because you've been alone too long.
Okay. All right. So before we get started, panelists, could you all introduce yourselves to our audience? I'll start with you, David.
Yeah, my name is David Carrico. I've been writing for a while, and I have, at last count, 16 books on the market.
So an overachiever. I like it. And then Mr. Declan Finn, who's a returning guest of the show. You might have heard, last episode, but, you know, we just go with it. Declan, can you introduce yourself in case they skipped the other 3 episodes?
Sure. My name is Declan Finn. As penance for my sins, I have grown up in New York City and lived here my entire life. I am the author of 30 published novels, half of which are on a bit of a hiatus because my last publisher imploded. I tend to jump all over genre. About half of what I do is urban fantasy, so I fit the subject.
Absolutely, you fit the subject. All right, and finally, last but not least, Mr. John Van Stry. Can you introduce yourself to the listeners and viewers?
Hi, I'm John Van Stry. I've been writing a good portion of my life. I've been getting published on Amazon. I'm an indie author. Since 2011, that's when I decided to make a stab at it. I'm now full-time. Currently, I got about 50 novels that are out there running that are on Amazon. Mostly, these days, I write a lot of urban fantasy, but I tend to write urban fantasy and science fiction, or rather fantasy and science fiction. Urban fantasy has been big, and for the last few years, it's been very good to me.
Okay. All right. So we're here, as we discussed, to talk about paranormal and urban fantasy critters. So what is it? Well, first off, Doc wanted me to ask, is there a difference between paranormal and urban fantasy?
Yes and no.
We'll go with... Okay.
Urban fantasy isn't always necessarily paranormal. It doesn't necessarily have paranormal creatures in it or paranormal activities. Werewolves by themselves, if they're the only aspect, it can be kind of borderline because werewolves have become fairly popular in modern fantasy. But paranormal definitely means you want to have all these creatures, all these things, the stuff that goes bump in the night, magic, that kind of stuff. Where urban fantasy, you may or may not, because cyberpunk's kind of urban fantasy when you think about it.
Okay. All right. What are your thoughts on that, David?
I guess my thoughts aren't too different than that. I believe there is a line between paranormal and urban fantasy. I believe that line is crossed a lot. There's a ton of stories out there that I think kind of merge the two. But paranormal to me always involves a strong aspect of supernaturalism, and urban fantasy can be pretty low-key and doesn't necessarily have a strong supernatural aspect to it.
Okay. And Declan, I know you always have opinions. Oh, go ahead, Doc.
No. I want to hear Declan's opinion. I know he's probably shocked by that.
Because he always has opinions. We share them with each other all the time.
Well, what's that? What's the phrase? Opinions are like such and such. Everyone has one. I probably can't complete that sentence on the air. As far as I'm concerned, yeah, there can be overlap, but urban fantasy is one would think a very specific subgenre. It's like, yes, technically it's fantasy, but it should theoretically be in a city. Granted, I've seen arguments that say it's been used interchangeably with contemporary fantasy, which is like, you mean I went through all the trouble of making sure the city plays a character in each book I write for nothing? Oh well.
Declan, it's not the first time you've overthought it.
It's pretty much my training.
No.
So I would say that to me, paranormal means not urban fantasy always has to have some element of magic, right? Like that fantasy is kind of defined as magic more often than not.
Yeah, I guess you'd be right on that.
But paranormal, you don't have to agree with me, John.
Yeah, I can.
Trust me, I keep Declan around despite the fact he disagrees with me.
It's part of his charm.
It is part of his charm, but I think you can have paranormal, like a good ghost story like The Inheritor by Marion Zimmer Bradley. There was no magic in it, and it was all ghost story / I think there might have been a possession. It's only been like 20 years since I read the book. Whereas the Serrated Edge series by Mercedes Lackey and the Diana Treeguard series all had magic in them, as well as particularly Diana Treeguard had ghosts, but it also had magic. Would that? I mean,
well, I would submit. I would submit that ghosts are a definite supernatural element.
So okay.
And the supernatural implies anything beyond what we would normally experience with our senses in the daylight in the normal world.
There is one thing I think I would add. I don't really think you're going to find any kind of like science fiction aspects in a paranormal story, but they are pretty common in urban fantasy to some extent. You can get some levels of science fiction in.
Oh yeah, particularly if you read anything Brandon Sanderson writes.
Oh, and John, I would recommend to you Tim Powers' last 3 books. I forget the name of the series, but it's like
I haven't had the time to read Tim Powers lately, but he's good.
Yeah, he's actually incorporated a lot of science with ghosts, with the geography of LA. It's like, hi, he's going to be one person who will incorporate science fiction, urban fantasy, paranormal, and everything else he can stuff into that box.
But I always think of Tim Powers as an urban fantasy author, really, more than a paranormal.
Okay.
Yeah. Tim's almost a genre by himself.
That's true.
All right. I will just say before we hit the elephant in the room that David and Declan, I am digging your libraries in the background. The perfect backdrop for an author are those crowded bookshelves. So bravo to you if you didn't plan that.
My library
I don't know.
Yeah. I was a reader
I can just see yours out of the corner
before I was a writer.
Background.
Oh, I like the music.
Guitars are a good background.
Guitars and basses. I made about half of those.
Okay.
Oh wow.
Cool.
Oh, that's amazing. So I came to this because because of who Cisca is. We've had Larry Correa come on the show a couple times, and he writes about werewolves and such. You've got friends in high places or low places, depending on who you're asking, but you've got friends. And so, I sort of became aware of the idea that they were sticking these, what I would consider fantasy creatures in modern settings as well. And then Jonathan Yanez gave me his Hunters for Hire about werewolf hunters. So that's where the idea for the episode came, like vampires and werewolves and mythical creatures. So you think that they can be in? Oh my! Do you think those kinds of creatures can cross the border between urban fantasy or paranormal, or is it one or the other?
I don't know of an urban fantasy that doesn't incorporate every monster it can get. Just look at Jim Butcher. I mean, is there a creature that he hasn't shot at in the borders of Chicago?
Did he get the Baba Yaga?
Level way more than I ever thought they should.
Actually,
did he ever shoot a Baba Yaga?
That might have been the last book. Sorry, there are so many bloody things in the last book that I'm not entirely certain. Somebody did recently.
Okay.
Sorry, what was that, Cisca?
I hear he's coming out with a new one. He has like a novella or a
Yeah.
full book coming out from Podium Audio.
He has a novella that already came out with, of course, James Marsters. His kid, James, middle initial Butcher, is also coming out with one either this week or sometime soon. He posted
That's
about
so
it.
precise, Jim. Middle initial.
Well, it sounds strange.
Mark B.
Well, it sounds better than saying, well, Jim's kid, James. It's like, no, it's like, it just sounds stupid.
Yeah, unfortunately,
Okay.
I don't get to
So-
read a lot of stuff these days. I'm usually too busy writing.
Yeah, that's
So-
my
I
big
hear
complaint about
David
being a
and-
writer is it cuts into my reading time.
Yeah.
I do audiobooks when I walk the dog, and that's my sacred personal time to listen to my books because that's how I fit it in. So
Hey.
John and David, I'm telling you, Declan, you need to get those audiobooks so I can buy them. I'm telling you. Do you guys agree that the the vampires and werewolves and such can appear in urban fantasy and paranormal, or do you think they're limited to one or the other?
I don't think they're limited to either.
I don't find them limited in the slightest. I've actually seen people work werewolves and vampires and all that into science fiction and do a really good job of it.
Okay. Oh, that's right. Jonathan, no, not Jonathan Yanni. Jonathan Brazé did that with his Werewolf
Mel
Marine
Todd.
Corps books.
Mel Todd and her Kaylee Chronicles.
We can't forget Mel Todd, who sponsored the several episodes
Oh, yeah.
of this podcast. Nice lady that she is.
There's
So,
an author
okay.
named Reich Spoor that has pretty successfully mixed it into a fantasy / space opera series.
Oh, is that how you pronounce his name? I always kept pronouncing it Rick.
No, it's Reich.
Okay.
He's very touchy about that. It's Reich.
Okay. So,
Bad jokes in there.
yeah, but we're gonna move right past them, Doc.
Yeah.
You're gonna tough this one out. So, what is it about these creatures, the paranormal / urban fantasy? Because when I wrote the show notes, I called everything paranormal because I didn't know the difference until we got started. So, thank you for that. So, what is it
J.R.
about
also
these
doesn't
creatures
know
that people?
the difference between his left and right hands.
No. See, if you hold it up, the infantry taught me the L is your left. That's right. So what is it about these creatures that speaks to you? And we'll start with you, David.
I think everybody is intrigued with the idea of just being different and being very different in some ways. Vampires, of course, originally started out from the aspect of Gothic horror. And it's, from what I recall, I don't read a lot of vampire stuff, although ironically I have written a vampire novel. From what I recall, it's a relatively recent trend that vampires have kind of at least partially crossed the line into being socially acceptable and perhaps even good guys. So we're always intrigued by things that are different. We're always intrigued by things that are borderline dangerous, and
Okay.
stuff like that. I grew up with kids that
What about
you couldn't keep firecrackers out of their hands.
You still can't keep them out of their hands.
Yeah.
Some things never change about childhood. What about
I
you,
can't
John?
keep
What is
them out
it
of my
about?
lab partner's hands.
Yeah.
Fair, well, John. What is it about these kinds of creatures that appeals to you? Do you think?
I think it's just the different points of view, the different personalities, the character traits. To me, sometimes it all goes back to like Aesop's fables and all that kind of thing, where you bring out the traits of the animal in this were creature or demons or devils or whatever, and you use that to highlight different aspects of humanity or personal traits, people. You can take things that are small and write them large, kind of a deal. You can examine interactions from different ways. And then, of course, there is just the raw power that a lot of these creatures tend to have, or the capabilities they have, the things they can do that normal human beings can't do. Those things everybody tends to find a little interesting. Part of it's escapism, but it just lets you play with things you can't play with normal, regular characters. And there is a big interest in it these days. So that's part of why I enjoy writing it. I have fun with it, and apparently a lot of people enjoy reading it.
Okay, and we'll ask the same question to you, Declan. What is it about it that these kinds of creatures that appeals to you? You've got at least 3 series that I can think of that include these kinds of critters. So, what's the draw?
The draw is I like to make things more difficult for my heroes each and every time. It's let's find something big and bad and evil and throw it at them as hard as possible and see what comes out of it. Usually, I get some interesting results out of my characters when I beat the crap out of them, really, and I'm always looking for the next level of threat. Heck, one of the series I'm working on now is a sequel to my vampire books, and I accidentally, the scene was always going to be, for example, throw a vampire up against a collection of triads who are all armed with those hollow points with balls in the center, only the balls are made of silver, because silver doesn't quite rifle that well. This and other metallurgy I picked up from Larry Correa. But, and much to my surprise, by the time I'm halfway through it, it's like, I think I just rewrote the police station sequence from the first Terminator movie.
Okay.
I mean, it's a good movie. I truly enjoyed it.
Okay. All right, Doc, you had a question?
But when is it that you guys all fell in love with this genre? Or maybe if you don't remember a time when you didn't, what would be your first memory?
Oh, the first memory I have is with the first guy who, well, to my mind, is the earliest person who wrote modern urban fantasy. Not Bram Stoker, who's a little not modern. There was a guy named Fred Saberhagen in the mid-'70s who had Dracula running around Chicago with a whole slew of vampires as, well, a local problem. And I read those when I was 9. Obviously not when they first came out. I'm not that old.
You sure?
Yes, I am.
To my son, I'm older than the TV set, so.
That's nice. Depends on how long your TV set lasts.
That's what the vampires would want you to think, isn't it, Doc? You're not that old.
You know what, JR?
I think
you can get food poisoning.
Let's all agree.
Go ahead.
Poor Declan.
Yeah, I think what brought me into the whole thing was, I was familiar with it. I've read a certain amount of paranormal stuff over the years, along with science fiction, because I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy. But what really got me interested in it, because I started out as a science fiction writer, and I was pretty much only writing science fiction of different stripes. Tried a little fantasy, but mostly stuck to SF. And I had a dream back in 2000 that was a very realistic dream. And it actually I eventually wrote as a novel, and it's very paranormal. And it was a really good dream. When I woke up, I wrote it all down. And my girlfriend at the time, Lisa Ann Norman, who's an author, she's like, "Oh, you got to write that as a book." And I tried several times to write it, kept having problems with it. And it wasn't until I think it was like 2013 I finally figured it out and wrote it, because at that point I was starting to publish stuff. And I enjoyed writing it. And that book and the sequel to it, the first 2 books, did really, really well. And that's when I started to focus on paranormal. My first big series, which is Portals of Infinity, has a touch of paranormal on it. And part of that was based on Carlos Castellanos, or however you say his last name, Teachings of Don Juan, which I've never read. I have never read that story. But I had a teacher in high school who was so enthralled with that story, she could not stop talking about it. And that stuck with me. And so I picked up on a lot of things she said and used that when I wrote that particular series. and apparently I hit it pretty well on the head. And then as time went on, and when I decided to launch a pen name, which has that cover you're so enthralled by, it I just decided to really launch something urban fantasy with a heavy paranormal focus into it, and it was a hit. So I enjoy it. My fans enjoy it, and I guess I've just been drawn into it a lot more than I expected to.
So the cover that he mentioned is on, if you go to his fan page, which is linked in the show notes, the one that's on the header bar. It's amazing enough that it got me intrigued that we're going to have him back to talk about that specific series. It's a picture of a dude and some chicks and a cat in a bed. It looks like it could be mature, but either way, we'll discuss that on a separate episode because the picture made me laugh. So, anyway. All right. So that's a good reason. I get the appeal of, the creatures that aren't quite human but are like us. It's the same reason people are fascinated by the uncanny valley when they start talking about like the robots too. It's the humanity but not quite that you see with some of these creatures. So,
The thing that's most interesting about Uncanny Valley?
what's
Dogs
that?
react to Uncanny Valley.
Do
a
they
lot
now?
of animals react to Uncanny Valley. That stuff, there's a lot of animals.
Yes.
Wow.
I once heard somebody suggest that, gee, everybody is affected by this. It is hardwired into people, which suggests, or somebody has suggested, that at one point we need to be very scared of things that looked human but weren't. Which I don't even want to think about that, really.
Maybe the when Homo sapien wasn't the only guy on the block, I guess maybe you could go back that far.
The Neanderthals and all the rest of that.
Right. But the running theory, and this is me not trying to bore you with our history nerds because Declan and I will go forever, was that they commingled more than they fought themselves into existence. So I don't know. It's an interesting thing to think about.
I'm not really sure what Uncanny Valley is, but I'm picking up the subtext here, and
So it's the idea that when things get close but not quite to looking human, like when robots, they're either when they look like robots, you're okay with it.
Like if there's that too symmetrical a face will freak people out, that kind of thing. Yeah, like there's psychological studies on that.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
It's things that aren't human masquerading as human, and there's just enough differences to throw you off and make you feel uncomfortable, and not just with the way they look, but with the way they act.
I can understand that. Lord knows. See, the scariest thing I ever read was Velvet Fields by Anne McCaffrey. And I've read horror, and that was still scary.
Okay.
Yeah. I had nightmares.
So do you guys have now I want to read it. So we'll talk offline. You give me the title, and I'll have to check it out and see if it's scary or you're just a wimp. we will come back and discuss this later. So do you guys have a favorite creature that you like to use in your stories? I'm going to guess, Declan, you like vampires more just because you're serious, but I could be wrong.
The problem is, it's hard to narrow down. It's like, I have favorite things to throw at characters. My St. Tommy NYPD book, it's the most. He's got the most problems with Draugr, which are a Norse kind of undead, which are shapeshifters, control weather, use magic, and I wound up. I don't even ask me how, but in my head they basically turned into the DC villain Doomsday.
I thought the Draugr were guardians of crypts and such.
Yeah, they were. I decided to expand it, and unfortunately, it's like,
okay,
wait, where did this design come from?
Okay.
So sometimes they spiral. By sometimes I mean always.
Yes, and.
Yes.
So Declan, your answer is which is your favorite is yes and.
Yeah, it depends on what I'm using it for.
All right, what about you, John? Do you have a favorite?
I tend to like feline, big cat-based creatures more. Then again, that's because for like 20 years of my life, I owned and raised and even trained big cats. I've had quite a few over the years. So I understand how they react. I understand what they're going to do. So I tend to lean more towards that, I guess, is just a bit of a personal bias there.
Okay, that's a good reason to do it, and if you can do it more authentically because reasons, and that's a very good one. It works for me. What about you, David? Do you have a favorite?
I'm not sure. First of all, I haven't written much in the way of urban or paranormal fantasy. I'm a big fan. In fact, going back to the earlier question, what got me into urban fantasy was reading Emma Bull's book War for the Oaks, which it's God, how long has that been out now? 20 years. That was a book that really connected me to urban / paranormal fantasy. But my fantasy writing has been more toward the epic fantasy side of things, and I admit to being a dragon geek. Uh, I dearly love dragons as characters, so that in my fantasy writing, that's typically what I write. The novel that is coming out in September, which is my vampire novel, The Blood is the Life, is really an exception for me. It's the first time I've written anything that crosses that particular line.
So would you then agree that if it has dragons in it, it must be fantasy? Doc's gonna cut me.
I didn't understand. You broke up so much, but I will gladly cut you anyways if you think you deserve it.
I won't agree with that because I've seen too many science fiction stories that have dragons or dragonoid characters, not the least of which is Anne McCaffrey's
Yes!
Dragons.
Thank you!
Yeah, I'm trying.
Whatever
And
the Pern. There we go, Pern. So
yeah,
I'm not going to put a dog in that fight, but I think from from Tolkien's Smaug on to who knows how many dragon characters. I think there's superlative fantasy characters as well.
That's been a running joke with Doc and I, is that dragons made Pern fantasy, and
They
she just
don't.
tries to cut me every
No,
time.
They're
Pern
genetically
was
engineered.
definitely science fiction.
Yes!
Definitely science fiction, because it was genetic engineering. That's how they got the dragons. And it's brought
Wait a
up.
minute. See, this is what
These guys.
See, this is what happened,
know their
Declan.
stuff.
Declan, this is what happens when we have Bane authors defending a Bane author. See, they stick together. It's like the mafia. Once you're in, you're in.
Well, hey,
on the other hand, dude, when you're wrong, you're wrong.
Hey, you want to be technical. The way we're discussing dragons, even in Flight of Dragons, which I don't know if you read the book or the movie, but one of the more interesting parts of it was how they went into the biochemistry of how they breathed fire, down to, oh yes, well, we eat limestone. The gastric juices basically turns it into Greek fire, and we've got a sparker in our mouths that ignites it as it comes out. It's like, that by that definition, that kind of makes it a little science fiction-y.
Yes.
Yeah, and to give
Doc,
credit where credit
did you
due,
bribe these people?
the science of that was
No.
from Peter Dickinson, I think. The story was actually Gordon Dixon.
Yeah. Correct.
Okay. So, Doc, do you have a favorite creature that falls into sort of the paranormal urban realm?
I mean, I've really enjoyed werewolves. Dragons aren't as common I think in paranormal. Definitely not in urban fantasy because dragons don't exactly fit in a city very well if they're big. I would say I like skinwalkers. I've been reading a lot of the Jane Yellowrock series, so skinwalkers come to mind. Declan, it's awesome. It's okay.
Yes.
What exactly
Skinwalkers
is
are
a
scary.
skinwalker? What is a skinwalker?
It's a Native American shifter type.
Okay.
And so what they do is, but instead of just shifting straight into werewolves and being controlled by the lunar cycle, They're kind of cheesy if they're not done right. I will say that one. They have to be done right, or else you've souped up your character creature too much. Because the negatives aren't as obvious, because typically they can, if they get enough genetic material, they can shift into anything. And they're not moon called, so like they don't lose their brains once a month to being a feral raging werewolf. So if they're not done, they're too powerful a creature in the series if they're not done right. And I've seen some series where they are not done right and they're too powerful a creature because they don't have all the problems, the negatives and drawbacks. They're not silver poisoned and things like that. So, but it comes out of Native American lore.
Yeah, traditionally they're a kind of warlock that will cut your skin off and wear it like a suit.
Yeah, they use an animal skin to turn into the were creature. That's why they're called skin walkers.
I've read that one, and then I've been reading the Jane Yellow Rock series where she does things different. Faith Hunter does things a little differently, but still, she adds in some other negatives. So there's definitely like the Skinwalker series. If you do things wrong in her series, you could become a liver eater and go crazy and nuts.
So I guess if I had to pick, I grew up, camping in the Appalachian Mountains. So for me, it'd probably be the werewolf stuff because, we'd see wolves when we go camping. So like I don't know. I've always kind of and then the first time I read about a person shifting into a wolf form, although I don't think they were technically werewolves, was in the Belgariad series by David Eddings. Yeah. They used magic to shift, but it was more polymorph than werewolf lichen kind of thing. But they didn't really get into the difference, so it could go either way. But yeah, that would be for me. But right now, we're going to pause this lovely discussion because I've got more to ask. While we pause to shameless. Well, it's Bane, so yeah, I guess it would be.
What if the United States and the Soviet Union had fought on land, sea, air, and the astral plane, struggled for dominion across parallel dimensions or on the surface of the moon? What wonders would have been unveiled? What terrors would have haunted mankind from those dark and dismal dimensions? Come closer, peer through a glass darkly, and discover the horrifying alternative visions of World War III from some of today's greatest minds in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Weird World War III. Available now from Bane Books at banebooks.com.
So we told Bane when we give these commercials that to keep them about a minute, but brevity is good too. And I think they hired the Micro Machine guy to just see how quickly they could get that commercial out. I promise I did not speed that up. I mean, I could understand them, so we're walking with it.
Never an alternative World War III. We haven't had World War III yet, for the record.
Well, technically,
that you know of.
At the date of this recording, there has been no World War III yet.
Technically, the Cold War was World War III.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we don't refer to it as World War III, though, is the thing.
The military historians usually do.
Yeah, they do.
It was worldwide, and everybody was pretty much going at it. It was just a Cold War.
Nobody. I've never heard active duty military refer to it as that. But you may be right because I haven't heard it.
I mean, all right, that's fair, but we won't dwell on that because that is not the topic today, Doc. So instead, I'll ask. I heard it referred to that urban fantasy because the idea of the episode was the creatures, and so there's a little bit of that overlap. But when someone mentioned urban fantasy, that it had to happen in a city. But we've talked to, or at least I've heard Larry Correia talk about it, where he has what they classify as urban fantasy happening in rural areas and whatnot too. So does it have to be a big city to be urban fantasy?
Obviously not, because the amount of times, Larry's referred to as urban fantasy. What the hell is her name?
Well, Larry does have a bunch of shit that takes place in Vegas.
Yeah. This is true, and
you don't get much more urban than Vegas.
Actually, to your point, you were talking about dragons don't fit in cities unless it's the basement of a Vegas hotel in Monster Hunter, whatever.
Which is exactly what Correia did.
Yes, that's why I brought it up.
Yeah.
But
Correia likes to take things and say, "See, I can make it work." I would hate to think about how it would have been to parent him as a child. You can't put on your legs two legs at a time. Watch me.
Oh, He grew up on a farm. It's probably a matter of shake out the pants first, make sure nothing falls out.
I think the term urban fantasy really just refers more to modern day.
Yeah.
It takes place in modern surroundings, urban, suburban, and even rural these days. It tends to be more of a suburban kind of area surroundings. I mean, I live out in the country these days. I moved back out to the country a few years ago, and this is nothing like what the country was like when I was a kid and I'd go visit my relatives up in Pennsylvania. That was rural. You don't kind of get that anymore these days.
Yeah.
You
gotta
really
move out
have
west
to
to
work
get
to
that.
find it. I would agree with that.
Well, problem with having
David, you-
rural fantasy is, too many sharp objects lying around. Oh, look, you're a vampire. Machete! Like, well, yeah, he's gone.
Too many loaded firearms as well.
That
right?
too.
I would say that definitely kids who've grown up more outdoors in rural areas have also a much more practical point of view on some of this. It's like, if that makes any sense. There's a certain level of, oh, look, I'm not lost in the woods. I know how to find my way.
Well, also just think about it. People who grew up rurally or spent time on farms as children understand, the dangers of animals. It's like a lot of domestic animals can be pretty deadly. More people are killed by cows than are killed by sharks. You
Number
fall
one
into a pig pen, no, you're gone, man. They'll eat you.
Number
When I was
one
a kid, the term
fact-
of what happened to little Timmy? Oh, Timmy fell in the pig pen. And
Yeah.
so people on farms and stuff, they know that animals are not always kind and friendly, so they're a little more cautious. They're not going to be just running into certain situations. And
in the 90s, the number one cause of injuries and animal attacks was squirrels at national parks.
was which?
Was squirrels.
Squirrels? Wow. Okay.
Because squirrels don't
I've
have great
had-
eyesight, and they're going here. They're trying to feed it a hot dog, and you know what else looks a lot like a hot dog? A finger.
Your fingers. Okay. So
Weird thing,
David, what
Tyler.
about you? Do you think urban fantasy can exist outside of like a major metropolitan area? And if so, what are your thoughts on it in general?
Certainly, I think the tropes and the tools of telling an urban fantasy story can be applied in a rural setting. I don't see any problem with that. Except that if you're going to write a story that has any kind of an element of noir to it, it almost has to be urban, because noir stories, the city is always a character in its own right. So if you're going to tell a story where the city is a character in your story, it's obviously got to be urban.
Okay. So what is it about these creatures like the vampires and the werewolves that make them, do you think, so eternal? Because you hear stories in legend and lore that go back across cultures that had never yet interacted, that go back as far as we know stories to go. What do you think keeps these kinds of stories so alive for people? The werewolves, the vampires, the
You know where the vampire myth comes from, right?
I do not. Is it Judas, right?
Excuse me? Judas? No.
Is it from the Bible with Judas?
No, it predates all that. I understand this. I used to deal with wild animals, and this is still a problem today for a lot of zoos and stuff. There's a thing known as flea death. Flea death is when you have so many fleas on you that they suck all the blood out of your body, and you literally have no blood in your body. And in the olden days, when you had people who didn't clean themselves very well, didn't have any good hygiene, flea death was a common occurrence. So people would come in and they would find somebody who had no blood in their body and was dead, because the fleas all leave after they drain you dry and they go elsewhere. So there's no obvious sign of what killed them. And cedar, those kind of woods, things that you use against vampires, that repels a lot of insects, especially bloodsuckers. Same for garlic. Same for, even in some cases, onions. These are things that repel bloodsuckers. With water, not crossing water. Fleas can't cross water. You look at a lot of the vampire myths, and it really ties back to these things that people happen to them, but they didn't understand. So that's
Okay.
why culture has that.
David or Declan, do you have anything to add, or because I didn't know any of that, but it's interesting.
Things you learn when you raise animals.
Yeah.
Ah,
You
Yeah.
mentioned You mentioned the Bible. There is at least one passage that refers to, depending on which translation you look at, that refers to a monster that is usually referred to as a lamia, which is I think, is considered to be a vampire variant. And Jewish tradition says that Lilith was supposedly Adam's first wife, and therefore, when whatever caused the splitting of the ways, she became a monster, and is, according to, again, which authority you're looking at, is sometimes referred to as a vampire. So, with that, you're going back 4 or 5 thousand years. So
Okay.
it's that version of the story alone, 4 or 5 thousand years. These stories have obviously been around for a long time, and you get into other cultures and you find similar kinds of stories. So
oh
it's
yeah,
been around for a long time.
yeah. You
So-
throw a rock at history and mythology, you'll find a vampire or something that looks a lot like a vampire somewhere in there. Trust me. After a while,
Well,
it's like, yes,
I think the concept of something that drains you dry is really scary innately. It hits at our core being of survivability, for sure.
Yeah. So there's a large factor of, the uncanny valley aspect to it lends an aspect of horror. God only knows how far people telling ghost stories around a campfire goes. I don't think there's any records on that I know of. But yeah, it's the idea of, yes, there's something that looks human and hunts humans. Yeah, it's going to terrify the crap out of most people if they
And
have any sense.
some of it also comes back to things like Aesop's fables and things. You're trying to teach kids, and you're trying to teach them through culture, or you're trying to teach people who didn't have a good education or good rational thought not to do certain things because those certain things would lead to danger. And sometimes taking something, you don't know what's killing these people, but they know that they keep seeing people going off and doing something. They find them dead, and they don't realize that, oh yeah, there's leopards in the trees that are eating everybody or something like that. So they come up with some kind of way to explain it, because things that hunt at night, humans have terrible night vision. You find somebody in the morning who's dead out in the fields or whatever, and the imagination is going to run wild because you really don't have a way of understanding it. And also, it's easier to get people to be a little more careful when you start telling stories about things. And of course, we all have imaginations that run wild. That's why we all have jobs, right?
Yeah.
Well,
I think a large part of it. Go ahead, Doc.
I was going to say, I think David hit on a great topic of Lilith. I mean, she's known as the mother of all demons. So where did demons and devils fit in this?
So-
Are they urban fantasy, paranormal,
Doc,
or
can
what?
you hold that one so I could?
No.
So one of the things to answer why I think these kinds of stories are eternal is because if you think about it from a evolutionary standpoint, the creatures that jumped at everything, whether they were right or wrong, their fear kept them alive, and the ones that weren't fearful sometimes got eaten by the bear or the tiger or whatever. So from a survival aspect, being fearful is almost bred into us, and so the love of the
Yeah.
horror, the fear aspect of it, I think, plays into it.
From a neurological standpoint, so when we review memories and we talk about them, we rehash them, whatever it is, we're ingraining them in our brains each time. And our brains are hardwired to take those negative experiences much quicker into account because of because they're tied with survivability. So it's part of it's how we're designed, but also I have a 10-year-old. I'm going to tell you, if I want him to learn something, if I put an entertaining video on, like when he was a little kid, my son's been able to explain force vectors and stuff like that because it was in a cartoon since he was like 6, or actually 4. So if you make something entertaining, so these tales, if they're entertaining, they start to teach because they're paying attention more.
Well,
too.
the thing
So you're
with-
telling me he can explain math to me?
Oh no, my son is actually much better at math than you are, JR, and has been for a couple years now.
one of the things about though demons and devils, the etymology of that word I think goes back to like the Greeks. It doesn't. Demons and devils are on the whole face of the thing kind of new. They've only been around for what 3,000-4,000 years. Those terms, if that, because it's a new term. It's a new concept. I had to do some research on it for a particular short series I wrote, where somebody went from being a god to being considered a demon. And it had to do with the changing of the word, because you had all these creatures that weren't considered demons in old mythology, but eventually became demons in more recent terms, because the words changed, the language changed, and people's fears changed, and modern culture changed.
Funny, by recent, you mean 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago?
I'd have to look up the time. I think it's 2,500 to 3,000 years ago, because it was, I think, around the times of ancient Greece that word started to change.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify your use of the word recent.
Well, in human history, that is kind of recent. Maybe not recorded history, but...
Show of hands, how many people thought when he meant recent, he meant maybe the last few hundred years?
Well, I mean, at grad school, I dealt with a lot of people that studied even farther back. So yeah, the Civil War revolution was even considered recent to them. So yeah, it's all about how far back you study on scope. I was tracking you, John.
I have a series that refers back many times to tens of thousands of years in drop comments to show how old somebody is. And so there are times I've had to sit down and look at like, okay, what was going on 100,000 years ago? Because I need a comment that will show that can be dropped that this person was there. So I've done a bit of history in the last couple of years.
Yeah, but trust me, I have noticed that
Declan,
not a lot of
more
people
of an
will
obsession.
I have noticed that there are people who don't know that much about anything that happened before they were born. There are friends of mine who don't know who fought in World War I, which broke my brain for a few hours. So, but just wanted to clarify.
That kind of breaks my brain thinking about that. How did you find? Never mind. Gotcha. But I mean, I did see something that actually pointed out something great about our perception of time, which is Martin Luther King and Anne Frank were born in the same year.
Really?
Really?
Yeah. And Marilyn Monroe and Queen Elizabeth. And it's just interesting how it changes our perception of the time at which things happen. So,
well, here's one that'll blow your mind. The last person receiving a pension from the Civil War died in 2019.
Yeah, I remember
was the daughter of one of the veterans.
Yep.
So the time issue is going to, we can come back to, because I think that could be interesting in how it plays with creatures that have such long lives. But Doc, before we do that, I derailed you briefly. You were going to ask about the Lilith and the demons and stuff. And that's an interesting segue.
I was ready to talk about it, actually, with like devils and demons being a more recent thing. But I think some of it also is
Declan.
You used to kind of poke at other cultures too. What's up, Declan?
He was doing air quotes around recent.
Yeah, I was just highlighting that part. Like
he's just highlighting recent.
more recent. You keep using this word.
You don't know what this means.
It is fun to get into other cultures and use them, especially in a paranormal setting. I mean, I've done a few stories where I've used mythologies from other Earth cultures and put them in there, and it's a bit of work. I was kind of inspired to that because Roger Zelazny did Lord of Light, which is heavily into Indian culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I dug into American Indian culture for one trilogy I wrote, and I had to get really deep into that because I wanted to make sure I got it right, or some of my ancestors would strangle me.
Okay. So is there any favorite of these other cultures when you're looking for creatures to use that, the mythical, if you know, as an umbrella term, that you prefer? Is there anyone that provides you the most fodder?
There's so many out there. I mean, Indian culture has some good ones. European culture has some very good ones, and American Indian culture actually has some good ones too. The American Indian god pantheon of a lot of the Midwestern and Western Indian tribes is really fascinating. Um, but like I said, if you want to find a god for any particular thing in the world, check out India.
Hmm.
I used
This
to
is
work.
true.
I used
Okay.
to manage a team of like 30 guys from India, guys and gals, and they used to love to tell me about all different gods and what they symbolized and what all the different things were. And I remember there was a TV show that actually caught one of these things, and I just know everybody who watched it was wondering, what the hell is this guy doing? Because he goes and puts an elephant on the front of the spaceship, but that has to do with an Indian thing. Where if you're going to travel that particular
Ganesh.
god, you go and make an offering to.
Well, and I think really also some of that is India is one of the few cultures still that has kept their polytheistic beliefs alive and vibrant still. But how
Now,
do you kind
keep
of
in
go? Hmm?
keep in mind the history of India. That place was a
Oh yeah.
crossroads of conquering armies for centuries, and the base culture simply assimilated the belief system of every conqueror, but they never got rid of anything. So of course they have a pantheon that includes everything that you can conceive of because they've assimilated it all from other cultures.
And
So
if you, sorry,
no,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. Go.
No, if you will ask, and if you ask any Hindu, and I've asked a few just to make sure I've got it right, most of them will insist that yes, we worship all these gods, but they're really all just different faces of one god. So it's like, so are you polytheistic or monotheistic? Let's flip a coin on that.
Yeah.
It depends which you talk to. Talk to a
Yeah.
Buddhist sometime. They're fascinating.
Yeah. Well,
So
I know one of the frustrating elements that Christian missionaries have faced in India over the years has been the tendency that, oh yes, we'll accept Jesus, we'll just put him on the shelf with everybody else.
Yeah.
All right, Doc, you had a question?
so I was going to ask, how is it that you kind of go about some of that research and use respectfully? Because I mean, in I know
You know,
all of you are guys who are great. You really do respect other cultures, other beliefs. But how is it that you carry that into your writing?
the whole respectful thing. First off, you got to understand someone's always going to find a problem with anything you do.
Yeah.
And so
Absolutely.
you don't worry about those. But if you read into the stuff enough, if you read enough of it, and you've talked to people involved in it who follow some of those religions, you'll get an understanding pretty quickly of what is good and what's bad. And the thing is not to make light of it, not to make fun of it. Or if you have someone who makes fun of it in your book, then they get a comeuppance. You know, for me,
Okay.
I'm part Native American. It's a small part, but I am part Native American. So when I was doing stuff with the Western tribes, because I'm part, Seneca Valley Mohawk, and this took place out west, so I couldn't use any of that. I wanted to be respectful because I always want to see American Indians done well. I have a friend. It's just a side story. I have a friend who's about a quarter Native American, and he hates the Westerns. The cowboys. He goes, yeah, and we were at a place many years ago, and I pulled out this movie. He goes, no, I don't want to see another one with the bad, the good white man and the bad, Indian, blah blah blah. I said, no, you really got to see this, and it was Little Big Man.
Oh, that's a good one.
Love that movie. He laughed so hard through that thing. He goes, you were right. I had to see that movie.
Okay.
Okay.
Usually usually I will find experts and I will go for clarification on certain things. There are, for example, my St. Tommy series, book 7, I wound up using a Satru mainly because I kept tripping over people online who were, well, how do I put this? European, they claimed to be, worshiping Norse deities, and they were general jerks is too light a word, and then it's like, okay, I know at least 4 different Asatru who have none of these beliefs. I need to ask for clarification. And, I went to Cisca. I went to Erin Lale, who was, funny enough, writing a book on the subject. And, she worships Loki. So I asked for clarification, and she said, all right, let me run you through the 7 different types. And, oh yeah, these are jerks. These are Nazis. These are morons. These are bro Satru who will say, Valhalla, bow, brother. And, they work out of a 7-Eleven and never saw military service. That's more or less a direct quote. And after a while, I just said, screw it, copy, paste, rewrite his dialogue.
So that's the problem, though. If you go for some of the pagan stuff out of Europe, is the Romans were so good at eradicating them and their beliefs that not a lot survived. So when you want to refer back, it's almost all neo whatever insert belief system because they're guessing.
Well, if you look around, you can find books on it. I have a book somewhere around here. It cost me like $70, and it's photocopies of stuff from one of the very old libraries somewhere in Europe. I forget where they went and they got all the ancient books on a bunch of different. This is for fairy stuff and the Gaelic things and the old Irish stuff. And they photocopied all the pages from all these manuscripts, put it together, and they just sell it on Amazon. And it's a great research thing because it's got all the old tales, all the old stuff. But it was not cheap. And if you look around, you can find collections. And some people have allowed these collections to be copied so they can be sold. And you can find things that are really old that get into some of this stuff and get into some of the older religions and older beliefs. Also, if you've got friends overseas, it's like I have some friends still kicking around in Scotland and stuff, and these people, their families have been there for like 1,000 years, so they have some really good stories they pass down.
Oh, and actually, something towards John's point earlier, I had in one of my novels somebody was raising a demon, and somebody took offense that the demon looked like Tiamat. Granted, I gave it 7 heads instead of 6 because sometimes you taste the rainbow, sometimes the rainbow tastes you. And I had even put in a line that you might recognize where, our bad guy is confessing to everything, and he was, he had been told to pick the form of the destructor. It's like, could I make it any clearer that I was ripping off Ghostbusters? But, and I wasn't going to pick the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. And somebody said, well, he's continuing the tradition of using the old gods as demons. It's like, no, this guy just picked the form to look like that because, a kaiju demon with 7 heads and blows fire and other miscellaneous weaponry is creepy. And also will make Godzilla go, nope, I'm going.
So what about you, David? Do you have when you try to incorporate these other cultures to get the mythos, is there any trick you use when you want to make sure it's respectful, as Doc had asked?
Oddly enough, I had to deal with that in the novel that Bain is publishing in September because my leading character is Jewish.
Uh-huh.
And I am very much not Jewish. So the story begins with a young Jewish man who is raised Orthodox discovering that he's a vampire and having an existential crisis because the Bible says, thou shalt not eat blood, for the blood is the life and is sacred to the Lord. That's the cornerstone of the kosher laws. And every Orthodox Jew would immediately have a frenzy because as a vampire, you can't exist if you don't eat blood. So that was the beginning of the book, but the book tries to play what I tried very hard to play honestly with Jewish beliefs and Jewish customs and Jewish practice, at the same time dealing with a character who was Jewish, but was in a position where his very existence was abhorrent to him. And I know a little bit about Jewish practices, maybe this much, just enough to get into trouble. But it was important to me that I get it right. So, among other things, by the time Bain decided to publish it, I think it had been read by 6 different Jewish people, at least 3 of which were Orthodox. And I got suggestions, and I was able to accept all of the suggestions because none of them made any real difference to the thrust of the story. But that would be my, regardless of what belief system you're trying to work with, that would be my suggestion to any writer is.
Now, I will notice that none of us are talking about sensitivity readers. We're talking about research readers.
Yes, exactly.
Subject matter experts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Subject matter experts is the.
Yeah.
So
people who are entitled to have an opinion.
yes. So we've talked about a lot about the creatures that you use. I didn't realize this topic was as big as it was. I would have narrowed it down had I known. Doc should have warned me. It's all her fault. So we're definitely going to do some more fireside chats in this field. But we have been at it. I know DragonCon sucked you into the vortex of work and sleep, and it's just been crazy.
There's sleep in there?
But before we leave, I assume she sleeps at the work when she's like mixing chemicals.
Yeah, strong acids and bases. Talk about things.
But before we go, we've talked about the kinds of creatures you've all written into your books. Is there any creature that would fit in sort of this realm that you haven't used that you want to at some point?
I'm still using
Declan has so many books. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't
know that he has an answer.
I have so many books, I've lost track. All right, so it's like, wait, I've used the Wendigo, I've used Hopping Vampires. It's like, no, I'm running out of monsters.
Sounds like you're just
okay. What about you, John?
I have one series that was heavily into demons and devils and the difference between the two. I have another series that looks under my pen name, which is basically about magic users, lycanthropes, and then a war against demons and invading from another dimension. It turns into a world kind of a war. So I think about the only thing I haven't really used is zombies, and I really didn't want to ever get on the zombie bus. I think I've pretty much used just about everything there is at this point.
I recommend using zombies as tools of a Bokor. That way they're weapons. They're not actually monsters.
What is a Bokor?
A Bokor.
Do I want to know?
It's out of voodoo or however you want to pronounce it, mythology, where he's basically a voodoo necromancer. That's the short version.
Okay. All right. And what about you, David? Is there any that you haven't used yet that you'd like to work into a story?
I'm sitting here contemplating a story involving a Japanese shifter landing in New Orleans at Mardi Gras. Oh,
that would be interesting. Go on. We'll have to have you back to talk about that one when it's done. And speaking of John and David, we'll definitely want to have you back to talk about your series that you've hinted at today, because Doc and I are curious. But before we let you go, what are you guys working on right now? David, since you were last, what are you writing right now?
Currently, I'm writing a space opera. Eric Flint and I have a contract with Bain to produce a new space opera, which is not set in any of his other series. And even though Eric has passed on, I have confirmed with Tony Weisskopf that she will be willing to accept the book if I finish it. So that's my next project. To? He and I plotted it together, but our approach was going to be I was going to write the first draft, and then he was going to do the polish and the submission draft. And since he passed away last week, that's no longer possible. So I've already confirmed with Tony that if I can get it done, she will consider it, and we will move on from there.
Okay. What about you, John? What are you writing right now?
I'm trying to get started on the sequel to Summer's End, which is the book I have coming out with Bane in December. I'd like to get that all wrapped up here, so hopefully by the end of next month, so I can get it out of my hair. And because for me, I'm getting used to this whole TradPub process of all the time it takes. So, get something, give it to them, and then I don't have to think about it for a while. Once that's done, I promised everybody I would write another book in the Portals of Infinity series. And then after that, I have like about 6 different things I want to write. It comes down to which one will I get to first.
That's a fair concern. And Declan, last but not least, I think you're on novel 127, but I can't confirm yet. What are you writing right now?
Well, it's only more like novel 35. I am editing
Only.
I'm editing two of my space opera novels at the moment, while simultaneously writing book 3 of the sequel series to the Vampires, while doing an outline for what I will simply refer to as my superhero series that is probably 6 months to a year away from even being started.
Okay.
So I'm a little busy.
And Doc, this will be airing the first or second week of August. So how are things going with the Dragon Con planning?
They're going.
So
Well, hey,
you're too sober to answer that question. I got it.
So the Sci-Fi Track has already published what their schedule is going to look like.
No, they've published what they think their schedule is going to look like right now. So we have submitted and done the big database lockout, which means most of us cannot go in and futz with things as they're getting finalized. And then at this point, by the time this airs, all the attending professionals and guests should have their prospective schedules, which they then have to approve, because we don't really know all of your calendars. You may have publisher meetings already set up that a panel may conflict with. So from there, and this is kind of funny because everybody always goes, when's the app going to get updated? And and I'm literally going, there's nothing to put in it yet, guys, so shut up. So we will then, they'll collect those responses and then finalize the app. And during that, I'll get emails like, hey, this person isn't able to do this panel because there's a conflict. Or, oh, yeah, this person's a Dragon Award winner and their nominee. And they're going to be coming to Dragon Con, find them a panel or 4.
When do the nominations or the nominees get announced?
The nominees get announced roughly. So so what happens is the nominations are closed July 19th, and then they'll tally them. They'll send out an email. Look for that if you're an author in the first week, because hopefully by the time this airs, the nominees will have been notified, and they will have done this very important thing that one of them forgot to do for a very long time last year.
Sorry.
Set it back by weeks, which is check your emails. Look for them, because he forgot to reply and say, great, I plan on being there. And so Dragon Con sat around waiting, and everybody else in fandom sat around waiting. And I'm not going to throw him under the bus because JR already did it.
It's okay. Rick is awesome. We love him. His books are amazing, so he gets a pass from me.
Happened. He totally was like, I forgot to hit send on the email.
I just wish they hadn't gotten rid of the urban fantasy, because putting everything in fantasy is like, it's just too much competition, because urban fantasy is nowhere near as big as fantasy, even though it's fairly large.
It's interesting you say that. So I think they have paranormal and urban together.
No, they just have fantasy.
There's there's the military fantasy.
No,
They change the categories each year, and I haven't. I put in my nominations and then forgot what categories. Sorry. But hopefully by this point that this airs, the nominees are out, and voting closes the Friday of DragonCon, so August 2nd, so that they can then. I think it's August 2nd. It may be the 3rd, but so make sure to vote.
So this will air on the 12th of August. And if you listen to what David said, you can figure out when we recorded this. But as usual, dear listener, we will do the panel where we'll get as many as we can acquire in a short amount of time of the finalists to have on the various panels. That is something that is near and dear to Doc's heart, so we do it every year. But with that said,
you have one,
David.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't beat much. You might be a vampire. I'm not quite sure. But so, David, we'll start with you. Can you tell listeners how they can find you? And as usual, it'll be in the show notes.
Okay. Amazon for sure. Just Google, search David Carrico. My website is davidcarricofiction.com. My Facebook writer page is David Carrico Fiction. And I think that's it.
Oh, okay. And what about you, John? How can listeners and viewers find you?
Well, I have a website. It has actually two addresses currently. It's vanstry.net or just johnvanstry.com. If you put my name in Google, you'll get me. I'm the only John Van Stry in the world.
Did you plan it that way?
No, and it's kind of funny because my name goes back like 600 years. So he's
like, yes, I took out all the competition. We do not ask where they went. So if you ever wondered what happened after the Josh fight, you can look to John Van Stry and find out because he's the last one.
What
about
died a couple of years ago?
Yeah. What about you, Declan? How can they find you online?
You can find me at declanfinn.substack, declanfinn.com, upstreamreviews.substack because I have a book review site, where we only review good books because too many bad ones. Also, I'm more or less active on Twitter and Facebook. I'm technically on every social media thing except for what's Trump's Truth, and that's only because it's like didn't get a chance to get on it because if I'm on if there is a social media platform except for BitChute, I haven't figured out how to work that one yet.
So, fun fact about John or Declan, he is the first and only person who has so many links in his bio because he's so all over the place that I ran out of characters on Anchor FM. So I had to decide which one to prioritize. And I finally like, Declan, can you please set up a link tree for everything so we can at least get one that sends them to you?
I love Linktree.
Yes.
We're going to do one for our show. And I'm looking at, once time permits, setting up our account for the podcast on BitChute and Rumble. I want to find out how we can get it to automatically port our YouTube over for people that want to listen outside of the YouTube ecosystem. And then last but not least, Declan mentioned his website where he reviews books. One of the things Doc and I have been batting around trying to get guests for, but we've talked about a panel, Fireside Chat, on book reviews, their importance and their role in publishing. We had almost set up with a few people who we can't name because they haven't confirmed, and then life happened, COVID-19 shut everything down, and so we're just at the point of trying to schedule some of that. Now, Declan, you just got added to the list. Congratulations. But that is something we are looking to do as well, because I think our audience is geared more towards the readers and the listeners of audiobooks, and I don't think all of them necessarily understand the value of book reviews, especially when every author you hear, oh, I never read my reviews. So to the reader, like, oh, they're not important then. They don't realize that reviews are for other readers.
I read my reviews for a couple of reasons. Sometimes I get great ideas there, but it gives me a general sense of like, okay, what pissed this person off? All right, I got to do more of that.
True. And then you get the diehards. There are some people who like had this one guy that followed like 12 or 14 authors, and he would 1-star everything, but he bought and verified every book in ongoing series. I'm like, why do you buy it to give it if you hate it that much, why are you still paying for it?
fan who lives in New Jersey. He's an author. In my opinion, he's not a very good one. He has reviewed every single thing I've written under both my name and my pen name, which if you go to my website, it's obvious. I don't try to hide it. And he's given every single book 3 stars. And I finally asked him about it one day because I ran into him online on something. And he was talking. I said, why do you hate me so much? You've given every book. Oh, no, those are all good reviews. And no, on Amazon, a 3-star review is a negative review. It even says so. 4 and 5 are positive, 3, 2, and 1 are negative. And you've written these long reviews. It's like, if you hate me so much, why have you bought every single book of mine? He's like, I thought it was reviews. I got to rethink my thing here. And I don't know if he stopped at that point. I stopped looking at it. But I always thought it was funny that here he is taking my books apart, trying to say all the things that I've done wrong. And to date, I've sold about 1 million copies of the stuff I've written. And he has terrible sales. And I actually read one of his books, and I was quite unimpressed. And I learned a long time ago, if you see somebody they're doing way better than you with something, try to figure out what they're doing right and what you're doing wrong. Don't go tearing them apart to try to prove you're better than them. No, you're not. Learn what they have learned from someone else. There's a lot to be said about trying to, mimic successful people to learn their habits so you can be successful too, not just attack them.
Okay, some good life lessons. So write that down in your book, people. And you can find us online at Twitter at twitter.com/SF_fantasy_show, Sierra Foxtrot _fantasy_show. Mostly we just post our podcasts and sometimes science news, but we occasionally look at it. So you can contact us there. Speaking of contacting us, Doc will answer your email if you do at blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com, because she does not need to sleep. So send her the email. You can find us on our Facebook group where all the shenanigans happen. And if you're not watching this, if you're listening, she's making all kinds of angry faces at me and like shaking her fist at the sky. So you can just sort of visualize it. But you can find us on Facebook where all the shenanigans happen at facebook.com/groups/Blasters and Blades Podcast. Again, /groups/Blasters and Blades Podcast. You can find us on our website at anchor.fm/blasters-and-blades. Again, anchor.fm/blasters-tech-and-tech-blades, where you can support the show for as little as 99 cents a month. You can help keep the lights on, or you can support the show over at buymeacoffee.com /author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com /author J.R. Handley. Be sure to put it in the comment section when you do that it's for the podcast. And I promise I will keep Doc Cisca and Nick Garber duly caffeinated. They will drink until their liver surrenders.
Never surrender.
All right, Doc, we've never asked you this, but how do you drink your coffee since I talked about caffeine?
I drink it black with a little bit of cream.
That works for me.
I don't want it as dark and black as my soul, like my colonel used to drink it. That's just a little too dark for me. I need to shed some light.
So this will be our parting wisdom. What about you, John? How do you take your coffee?
I'm a tea drinker, not much of a coffee drinker.
Okay, what kind of tea though?
For mornings, it's English breakfast tea.
Okay.
And for afternoons, it's fairly often Irish breakfast tea, which is a little more mellow. And then just there's a couple different black teas I like.
So if you like iced tea, which I mean, if you're in the South, anywhere in the South or anywhere,
sweet
right
tea.
now, really.
It's required. Yep.
Not just sweet, but get Lady Grey. It makes a really amazing iced tea. It brings out a lot of those citrus notes. It's beautiful.
I'll have to check it out. I'm a bit of a tea snob. You should see my tea locker.
I grew up with a dad who drinks nothing but tea and a mom who drinks coffee. So
because they didn't want to share. That's why they got together and it worked. So
only you were joking. Only you were joking. My father was such a tea snob, you could not put coffee in the teacup because if you put coffee in his cup that he drank tea out of, he could swear he would taste it forever.
Well, you can because coffee is a strong flavor. When I was in grad school in Philly, go ahead.
We had to have separate makers because if you tried to make tea in the coffee maker, the result was abominable.
I actually have an automated tea machine, or an automatic tea maker. I have a couple of them because they don't make them anymore, so I bought a bunch.
Yeah.
So when I was in grad school, there was a local coffee shop in Villanova that had a tea that actually tasted like Big Red Gum, whatever that brand. I've never been able to find it, but that's the one tea I actually liked that wasn't sweet and iced. So, but for the rest of it, it's just French vanilla creamer for me. But what about you, Declan? How do you consume it?
Well, technically it's light and sweet, but that is comparative, considering that most of the coffees I use are like 50% chicory, so they're stronger.
Why would you
than
do that to yourself?
Because
chicory is disgusting.
Because sometimes when I actually need to wake up, it's okay, coffee with chicory. Like, okay, I'm awake now.
So
I don't think I've ever had coffee with chicory. I have discovered
that I have it.
Bonnie sweet cream. It kind of makes your coffee taste like coffee ice cream.
Yeah. Coffee with chicory is should get in New Orleans when you get your beignet.
Yeah, that's where we order it from.
So
because we know it works.
Little known fact, Declan, the chicory was why the South lost the war. If they had just had real coffee, it'd have been a different country. But what about you, David? How do you consume your coffee?
I don't. I grew up in a military family. My dad liked his coffee strong enough to walk itself into the living room, pour itself in his cup.
Yes.
I never acquired the taste. I'm like John. Irish breakfast tea in the morning, straight Earl Grey in the evening, and mass quantities of it.
So when you make your Earl Grey, do you say Earl Grey hot and go all Picard on it?
No, I was drinking
Earl
Grey long before Picard was even thought of.
Now, what's your favorite brand of Earl Grey, though? What's your favorite brand?
The best I can get locally is Twinings, but I can't remember the brand off the top of my head. But I got an import from England one time that was just superb, but I can't remember what the
my
brand
dad
is.
loves Fortnum and Mason, which is an English.
Check out uptontea.com.
Yeah.
They're up in, like, I think Seattle or something like that, and they have every tea you can think of. That's where I get most of my tea from.
I get my teas from Teavana locally, but
unfortunately,
they're good.
Teavanas are gone.
So,
they had
really after Starbucks bought them out, Teavana locally.
There's a place at the local mall that is like Teavana, but
you're lucky then.
Starbucks. I live in Atlanta. We got a lot of great stuff down here. We also have.
I'm in Texas, but I'm way out in the country. Well, not way out, but far enough out.
As long as you're not in.
All right, Doc.
Good.
I couldn't stomach listening to all of them tell me they put pineapple on their pizza, so we won't ask. Can you bring us home and close this out for us, Doc?
That's because you know that you might lose this one because you already lost the Pern argument. So,
I'm afraid that like you and Bane have ganged up on me, and like this is some sort of conspiracy going on. So just close the episode for us.
It's not my fault that they're right. So thank you for spending time with us. We do appreciate it because it is precious. For Nick, Garber, and JR, I am Cisca. This was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week, same time, same place, indulging our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, all things that go boom, and of course, torturing JR because that's the best part.